The American small aircraft industry is in freefall. What was once the backbone of general aviation, the sector that taught generations to fly and built the dreams of weekend pilots across the nation, is now gasping for survival. The warning signs have been flashing red for months, but few paid attention until it was too late. Now, the numbers tell a story that executives won't admit publicly. This isn't a downturn, it's a structural collapse. Flight schools are cancelling orders. Private owners are grounding planes they can no longer afford to maintain. And the manufacturers that once dominated American skies are watching their assembly lines slow to a crawl, while unsold inventory piles up in hangars from coast to coast. Interest rates that doubled in 18 months have turned affordable flying into an impossible luxury. Insurance premiums have surged beyond reason. And the pilot shortage everyone predicted has become a buyer shortage nobody saw coming. 5 legendary names stand at the center of this crisis. Brands that taught America to fly, that built the planes your grandfather learned in, that represented freedom, adventure, and the open sky. But heritage doesn't pay the bills. Reputation can't negotiate with lenders, and nostalgia won't clear inventory when dealers are drowning in floor plan debt that compounds by the day. What you're about to discover isn't speculation. It's documented through supplier contracts, dealer testimonies, financial filings, and production data that paint a picture far darker than industry spokespeople will admit. These 5 manufacturers are facing pressures they've never encountered before, and the math simply doesn't work anymore. Some will downsize, others will merge, but not all of them will see 2027. The question isn't whether the small plane market will recover, it's which of these iconic brands will still exist when it does. Let's pull back the curtain on what's really happening behind the polished marketing and carefully worded press releases, because when the aircraft that defined American aviation start disappearing, it's not just business, it's the end of an era. 1. Piper Aircraft, the icon. Running on empty Piper aircraft once represented the purest form of the American aviation dream. For over 8 decades, the name meant reliability, accessibility, and the kind of honest engineering that turned ordinary people into pilots. The Cherokee, the Warrior, the Archer, these weren't just model names, they were rites of passage. But in 2025, Piper finds itself in a battle it may not win. The company that taught millions to fly is now fighting to stay airborne itself. The trouble began with inventory accumulation that accelerated throughout 2023 and intensified into 2024. Dealer networks across the Southeast and Midwest report unsold aircraft counts climbing by over 55% year over year, while actual deliveries to end customers collapsed by nearly 38% during the same period. That gap represents more than statistics. It represents aircraft sitting in heated hangars, accumulating storage costs, insurance premiums, and most devastating of all, compounding floor plan interest that now exceeds 12% annually. Financial data reviewed from aviation lending institutions reveals Piper's dealer network is carrying approximately $340 million in financed inventory, a figure that would be manageable in a healthy market. But this isn't a healthy market. Every month, those aircraft remain unsold. Dealers absorb interest payments approaching $3.5 million collectively. Small regional dealers operating on thin margins simply cannot sustain that burn rate. Several have already returned allocations to the factory, a move that would have been unthinkable 3 years ago. Inside Piper's Vero Beach facility, the impact is visible and undeniable. Production schedules that once ran at near capacity have been throttled back to preserve cash flow. Supplier contracts show reduced component orders, extended payment terms, and in some cases, outright delays in honoring invoices beyond 90 days. One major avionics supplier confirmed that Piper's purchasing volume dropped 41% compared to the prior fiscal year, a reduction that signals more than temporary adjustment. The workforce has felt the pressure directly. Contract positions were eliminated first, followed by voluntary separation packages offered to long-term employees. While official statements frame these moves as strategic realignment, factory floor sources describe a facility operating at roughly 60% of its pandemic-era output. The silence between rivet guns tells its own story. What makes Piper's situation particularly acute is its position in the market. The company built its reputation on entry-level and mid-tier aircraft, the planes that student pilots and private owners could realistically afford. But affordability has become a cruel joke in today's economy. Aviation financing that once carried rates near 4% now sits above 10%, and approval rates have tightened dramatically. First-time buyers who would have qualified easily in 2021 are now being rejected outright. The core audience that sustained Piper for generations has been priced out of the market entirely. Resale values compound the problem. Used Piper aircraft have depreciated between 18% and 25% since their pandemic peak, destroying equity for existing owners and making new purchases even less appealing. Why pay $450,000 for a new Archer when a 3-year-old model with low hours sells for $340,000? That price compression devastates both new sales and dealer margins. Flight schools, once Piper's most reliable customers, have pulled back aggressively. Training operations that placed bulk orders during the pilot shortage now face their own financial strain. Student enrollment has softened, and schools cannot justify adding aircraft when utilization rates on existing fleets have dropped. One prominent training center in Arizona canceled a 12-aircraft order, citing market uncertainty and financing constraints. That single cancellation represented over $5 million in expected revenue that simply evaporated. The pressure extends beyond manufacturing into the service and support network that defines long-term viability. Parts availability has become inconsistent. Lead times for critical components now stretch beyond 120 days in some cases. Authorized service centers report difficulty getting warranty claims processed promptly, forcing them to carry costs they cannot pass through. These operational strains erode the confidence that once made Piper synonymous with dependability. Piper's management insists the company is navigating through a cyclical downturn, that demand will return as interest rates stabilize. But private conversations with dealers and suppliers reveal a darker assessment. This isn't a cycle, it's a reset. The market that made Piper dominant no longer exists, and the economics that allowed affordable personal flying have fundamentally changed. The brand that brought general aviation to the middle class now faces a middle class that can no longer afford it. Piper's struggle isn't about quality or reputation, it's about mathematics. When monthly payments on a basic trainer exceed what families spend on mortgages, demand doesn't soften, it disappears. And without demand, even the strongest heritage becomes a weight rather than a foundation. 2. Cessna, volume without velocity. Cessna Aircraft Company built the most successful line of light aircraft in aviation history. The Cessna 172 Skyhawk alone has produced over 44,000 units since 1956, making it the most manufactured aircraft in the world. That legacy represents more than numbers. It represents trust, ubiquity, and a brand so embedded in American aviation that Cessna became shorthand for small plane itself. But volume only matters when it moves, and in 2025, Cessna's legendary production capacity has become a liability it cannot easily escape. Under Textron Aviation's corporate umbrella, Cessna operates with resources that smaller manufacturers can only dream of. Access to capital markets, diversified revenue streams, and global distribution networks should provide insulation against downturns. Yet even those advantages cannot overcome the fundamental problem facing all of general aviation. Buyers have vanished. Textron's most recent quarterly filings reveal that general aviation revenues declined 11% year over year, with light aircraft deliveries falling even more sharply. Dealer inventory data obtained from financing sources shows Cessna's distribution network holding approximately 890 unsold aircraft as of Q3 2024, representing a 67% increase compared to the prior year. Those aircraft span the entire product range from single-engine piston trainers to high-performance turboprops. Each one represents capital trapped in depreciating assets, while interest costs accumulate relentlessly. Dealers describe the pressure in stark terms. One multi-brand distributor in Texas stated bluntly that carrying Cessna inventory now costs his operation over $28,000 monthly in financing charges alone. The production response has been measured but unmistakable. Manufacturing schedules at the Independence, Kansas facility have been adjusted downward multiple times over the past 18 months. Worker hours have been reduced through a combination of shortened shifts and extended furloughs. Component suppliers report purchase order volumes declining by 35% to 40% compared to pandemic-era peaks. Those reductions protect short-term cash flow, but carry long-term risks. Skilled aviation manufacturing labor doesn't wait around during extended slowdowns. Experienced workers who leave for other industries rarely return. Cessna's challenge differs from smaller manufacturers in one critical respect: scale. The infrastructure required to maintain global operations, certification across dozens of countries, extensive dealer networks, and comprehensive support systems demands massive fixed costs, regardless of production volume. When output drops, those fixed costs don't decrease proportionally. They become a heavier burden on every aircraft produced. Unit economics deteriorate rapidly, squeezing margins that were already under pressure from raw material inflation and labor cost increases. The used aircraft market has become particularly punishing for Cessna. Thousands of late-model 172s and 182s are competing for the same shrinking pool of buyers. Asking prices have fallen 20% to 30% from their 2021 peaks, and actual transaction prices often sit below asking by another 10%. That price collapse makes new aircraft purchases nearly impossible to justify economically. A buyer evaluating a $450,000 new Skyhawk versus a $310,000 four-year-old model with 600 hours makes a predictable choice. The value proposition for new aircraft has simply broken down. Flight training demand, historically Cessna's most stable market segment, has softened considerably. The pilot shortage that drove unprecedented orders in 2021 and 2022 has moderated as airlines slowed hiring and regional carriers adjusted capacity. Training academies that planned aggressive fleet expansions have shelved those plans indefinitely. Several prominent schools have actually reduced their fleets, selling aircraft into an already saturated used market. One major training organization in Florida offloaded 18 Cessna 172s in a single auction, accepting bids well below book value just to generate liquidity. Financing availability represents perhaps the most significant headwind. Aviation lenders, who once competed aggressively for business, have raised standards dramatically. Down payment requirements have increased from 10% to 20% or higher. Credit score thresholds have risen. Income verification has intensified. And most impactfully, interest rates have more than doubled. A $300,000 aircraft financed at 10.5% over 20 years carries a monthly payment exceeding $2,900. That same loan at 4.5% would have been under $1,900. The payment differential has pushed countless potential buyers out of qualification range entirely. Cessna's response has included aggressive incentive programs, promotional financing offers, and dealer support packages. But incentives only work if buyers exist to incentivize. Reducing the price by $30,000 doesn't help if the customer still can't qualify for the loan. The fundamental problem isn't transaction structure, it's affordability at the macro level. Inside Textron's executive suite, Cessna's struggles are being absorbed within a larger portfolio that includes business jets, military contracts, and industrial operations. That diversification provides breathing room that standalone manufacturers don't have, but it also means Cessna may not receive the focused intervention required to navigate this crisis effectively. The brand could survive as a smaller, diminished version of itself, maintained primarily for strategic reasons rather than profitability. The irony is profound. Cessna's greatest strength, its massive installed base and production capability, has become its greatest vulnerability. The company built an empire on volume, but volume without velocity is just inventory. And inventory in aviation, unlike wine, doesn't improve with age. It depreciates, accumulates costs, and eventually becomes a write-off that destroys value for everyone involved. Cessna will likely survive in some form. The brand carries too much historical weight to disappear entirely. But the Cessna that emerges from this crisis will be fundamentally different from the one that entered it. Smaller, leaner, and operating in a market that may never again support the volume that once defined American light aircraft manufacturing. 3. Glasair Aviation. Innovation grounded by reality. Glasair Aviation represented something different in general aviation, where established manufacturers focused on incremental improvements to decades-old designs. Glasair pushed boundaries, composite construction, kit aircraft that serious builders could assemble, and performance specifications that challenged factory-built aircraft at a fraction of the cost. For enthusiasts willing to invest hundreds of hours in construction, Glasair offered something rare: cutting-edge aviation technology within reach of dedicated individuals. But in 2025, that innovative spirit cannot overcome the brutal economics crushing the experimental aircraft market. The kit aircraft segment operates on fundamentally different economics than certified production aircraft. Without the crushing regulatory burden of FAA certification for each model, kit manufacturers can innovate faster and price lower. But that freedom comes with trade-offs. Buyers must invest significant time and skill to complete their aircraft. Financing is difficult or impossible to obtain for unfinished kits, and resale values remain deeply uncertain, creating hesitation among potential customers. Glasair's challenges emerged from multiple directions simultaneously. During the pandemic, experimental aviation saw renewed interest as people sought projects and alternatives to commercial travel. Kit sales increased, and the company expanded its production of sub-assemblies and quick-build options to meet demand. But that demand proved temporary. As the world reopened and priorities shifted, the hobbyist builders who sustained the experimental market redirected their time and money elsewhere. Sales data from industry tracking sources shows Glasair's kit deliveries dropped approximately 58% between 2022 and 2024. That collapse in volume hit a business model that depends on steady turnover to cover fixed costs. Unlike production aircraft manufacturers who can slow assembly lines, kit producers still carry costs for tooling, molds, raw materials, inventory, and the skilled technicians who prepare components. When orders dry up, those costs become unsustainable quickly. The financial strain became visible through supplier relationships. Multiple composite material vendors confirmed that Glasair extended payment terms beyond 120 days, and in some cases failed to meet even those extended deadlines. One supplier in the Pacific Northwest stated that Glasair's account moved to cash-on-delivery terms after accumulated arrears exceeded $180,000. That shift from credit to cash-only transactions is the aviation equivalent of a cardiac event. It signals that trust has evaporated and survival has become uncertain. Inside Glasair's facility, once busy workstations sit idle for days at a time. The workforce that peaked near 40 employees has contracted to fewer than 15. Those remaining focus primarily on customer support for existing builders rather than new kit production. Phone support has become inconsistent. Technical documentation updates have stalled. And parts availability for builders encountering issues has become unpredictable, sometimes stretching beyond 90 days for components that should ship within 2 weeks. The experimental aircraft market faces a demographic challenge that Glasair cannot solve alone. The average kit builder is in their late 50s or early 60s. Younger potential enthusiasts face time constraints from careers and family obligations that make 1,000-hour build projects impractical. Additionally, the cost advantage that once made kit aircraft attractive has diminished considerably. When engine prices, avionics, and materials are included, a completed Glasair kit can approach $200,000 to $250,000, a price point that puts it uncomfortably close to used certified aircraft that offer better financing options and higher resale value. Glasair's innovation in composite construction, once a differentiator, has become standard across the industry. Cirrus, Diamond, and others brought composites to certified production aircraft, eliminating Glasair's technical advantage. What remains is a company selling products that require extensive skill, time, and capital to compete in a market where all three are increasingly scarce. The company's website remains active, and social media accounts post occasional updates, but the frequency and substance have declined noticeably. Industry observers who follow experimental aviation closely note that Glasair has withdrawn from major air shows and events where it once maintained prominent presence. That retreat from visibility suggests a company in survival mode rather than growth mode. Glasair's situation reflects a harsh truth about niche manufacturing. Innovation alone isn't enough. A company can build the most advanced, efficient, exciting product in its category, but if market conditions eliminate the customer base, excellence becomes irrelevant. Glasair offered builders the chance to construct aircraft that rivaled factory performance at lower cost. That value proposition worked when people had time, confidence, and capital. In 2025, those conditions have evaporated for enough potential customers that Glasair's business model has fractured. Unlike larger manufacturers with diversified product lines or corporate parents, Glasair has no cushion. Every month of negative cash flow draws down reserves that were never deep to begin with. The experimental aircraft market will survive in some form. Small-scale builders creating one-off designs, ultralight manufacturers, and certain established kit producers will persist. But Glasair's position has become increasingly tenuous. Without a dramatic shift in market conditions or a capital infusion from external sources, the brand that once represented the cutting edge of affordable performance may not reach 2027. 4. Aviat Aircraft Heritage. Without buyers, Aviat Aircraft carries a lineage that stretches back to the golden age of American aviation. The Pitts Special, arguably the most famous aerobatic biplane ever designed, came from the company's heritage. The Husky, a beloved backcountry aircraft, continues that tradition of rugged, purpose-built flying machines. For pilots who value stick and rudder flying, tailwheel proficiency, and aircraft that prioritize capability over comfort, Aviat represented something increasingly rare: authenticity. But authenticity doesn't generate revenue when buyers disappear. And in 2025, Aviat faces the reality that nostalgia cannot sustain a manufacturing operation. Aviat's business model has always been niche by design. The company never chased volume. Production numbers measured in dozens per year rather than hundreds. Customers came from specific segments: aerobatic pilots, backcountry adventurers, flight schools teaching conventional gear techniques, and enthusiasts who valued simplicity over sophistication. That focused approach worked for decades because those niche markets, while small, remained stable and passionate. That stability has shattered. Financial filings show Aviat's annual revenue dropping below $20 million for the first time in over a decade, with production deliveries falling to fewer than 30 aircraft in the most recent fiscal year. Those numbers reflect more than a slowdown. They represent a market in near total collapse. When a company selling aircraft priced between $300,000 and $400,000 delivers only 30 units annually, the math becomes brutal. Revenue barely covers operational costs, leaving nothing for development, facility maintenance, or the capital reserves required to weather extended downturns. Dealer networks for Aviat have always been limited, but even those relationships have frayed. Multiple representatives confirmed that floor plan financing for Aviat aircraft has become nearly impossible to obtain. Lenders view the brand as too risky, given low production volume and uncertain resale values. Without floor plan financing, dealers cannot stock inventory, which means customers must order aircraft sight unseen with deposits and wait months for delivery. That process worked when demand was strong. In today's market, it's a deal killer. The aerobatic community, once Aviat's most reliable customer base, has contracted significantly. Competition aerobatics is an expensive, time-intensive pursuit that requires constant training, travel, and aircraft maintenance. As discretionary income tightened and aviation costs soared, participation rates dropped. Airshow calendars that once featured dozens of competitions annually now list fewer than half that number. When the customer base shrinks, manufacturers serving that base inevitably suffer. Backcountry flying, the other pillar supporting Aviat's business, faces its own challenges. While the segment has grown in popularity, competition has intensified dramatically. Carbon Cub, Cubcrafters and others have entered the market with modern designs that offer better performance, superior support networks, and in some cases, lower prices. Aviat's Husky, while beloved by existing owners, has seen its market share eroded by competitors who invested in updates and marketing, while Aviat conserved cash. Inside Aviat's Afton, Wyoming facility, the production floor operates at a pace that would have been unthinkable during better times. Aircraft that once moved through assembly in structured schedules now sit partially completed for weeks, awaiting parts, customer decisions, or simply the next worker's availability. The workforce has been reduced to essential personnel only. Supplier relationships have become transactional rather than collaborative. Components arrive just in time because Aviat cannot afford to maintain inventory, creating vulnerability to any supply chain disruption. The used market for Aviat aircraft has become particularly challenging. Pit Specials and Huskies listed for sale often sit for 6 months or longer before finding buyers. Asking prices have dropped 25% to 35% from peak values, and sellers frequently accept offers significantly below asking just to close deals. That price erosion makes new aircraft purchases nearly impossible to justify. Why spend $360,000 on a new Husky when a well-maintained 5-year-old model sells for $240,000? Aviat's management has attempted to adapt. The company explored electric propulsion partnerships, investigated opportunities in the light sport aircraft category, and considered contract manufacturing for other aviation companies. But all of those initiatives require capital that Aviat simply doesn't have. Without strong cash flow or access to outside investment, strategic pivots remain concepts rather than realities. The tragic aspect of Aviat's situation is that the company's products remain excellent. Owners consistently praise build quality, flying characteristics, and the pure joy of operating these aircraft. Customer satisfaction isn't the problem. The problem is that there aren't enough customers, and those who remain can't afford to buy, can't get financing, or choose competitors offering better value propositions. Aviat aircraft represents the vulnerability of specialized manufacturers serving passion-driven markets. When economic conditions force people to choose between passion and pragmatism, passion loses. The company that built aircraft for pilots who truly love flying now faces a market where love doesn't translate to purchase orders. Heritage preserves history but doesn't pay workers. And without revenue, even the most authentic brand becomes unsustainable. 5. A Coupe. The Forgotten Classics Final Chapter. The Coupe holds a unique place in aviation history. Designed in the 1930s with revolutionary safety features, including coordinated flight controls that eliminated the need for rudder pedals, The aircraft was marketed as the plane that can't spin or stall. Thousands were produced in the decades following World War II, and the design achieved cult status among pilots who appreciated its unique flying characteristics and Art Deco aesthetic. But in 2025, the Ercoupe exists primarily as a historical footnote, and the small companies attempting to keep it alive are facing extinction. Unlike the other manufacturers on this list, Ercoupe production ended decades ago. What remains is an ecosystem of parts suppliers, specialty maintenance shops, and small-scale rebuilders who preserve and restore existing aircraft. That ecosystem has sustained a modest but dedicated community of Ercoupe owners who kept these vintage aircraft flying through careful maintenance and parts fabrication when originals became unavailable. But that community is aging rapidly, and the economic pressures crushing general aviation are eliminating what little remains of Ercoupe support infrastructure. Univair Aircraft Corporation, the primary supplier of Ercoupe parts and one of the few companies maintaining production rights to certain components, has drastically reduced its Ercoupe-related operations. Industry sources confirm that parts availability has become critically limited. Components that were once readily available now require months to source if they can be found at all. Several specialty items have been discontinued entirely, forcing owners to fabricate custom replacements or ground their aircraft permanently. The Ercoupe owner demographic skews heavily toward pilots in their 60s and 70s. These are individuals who learned to fly in an era when aircraft ownership was accessible and who maintained their planes as affordable weekend transportation. But as this generation ages, few younger pilots are replacing them. The reasons are economic and practical. Ercoupes are no longer cheap to acquire or maintain. Parts scarcity drives costs up. Insurance has become difficult to obtain and expensive when available. And the aircraft's limited performance specifications make it impractical for anything beyond local recreational flying. Aircraft valuation data shows Ercoupe prices have actually declined in absolute terms over the past 5 years, despite general inflation. A model that might have sold for $35,000 in 2019 now struggles to find buyers at $28,000. That price compression reflects oversupply as aging owners attempt to sell aircraft into a market with almost no demand. Estate sales and probate situations have flooded the market with Ercoupes, whose families simply want them gone, often accepting any reasonable offer just to avoid ongoing storage and insurance costs. The maintenance shops that specialized in Ercoupe service have largely closed or shifted focus to more common aircraft types, where parts availability and customer volume can sustain business operations. One legendary facility in California that maintained dozens of Ercoupes annually ceased operations in 2023 after 47 years of service. The mechanic who ran it stated simply that there wasn't enough work anymore to justify staying open. When specialized knowledge disappears, aircraft that depend on that knowledge become progressively harder to maintain. Type clubs and owner associations that once provided community, technical support, and collective purchasing power have seen membership decline precipitously. The Ercoupe Owners Club, which once had over 2,000 members, now counts fewer than 400. Annual fly-ins that regularly attracted 50 or more aircraft now draw a dozen if they occur at all. That social infrastructure was never just about socializing. It was about knowledge sharing, parts sourcing, and the collective expertise required to keep vintage aircraft airworthy. As those networks dissolve, individual owners become isolated, making aircraft maintenance progressively more difficult and expensive. Airworthiness concerns have become significant. The FAA has increased scrutiny of vintage aircraft, particularly those with limited parts availability and aging airframes that may have accumulated corrosion or structural fatigue over decades. Several Ercoupes have been grounded following annual inspections that identified issues owners either couldn't afford to repair or couldn't source parts to address. Once grounded, these aircraft rarely return to service. They sit in hangars deteriorating until eventually scrapped or abandoned. The Ercoupe story is fundamentally different from the other manufacturers discussed. This isn't about a company failing to adapt or about market conditions crushing current production. It's about the end stage of aviation history. The Ercoupe represents an era that has passed, and the infrastructure required to preserve access to that era is collapsing. What remains are individual aircraft slowly aging out of airworthiness, supported by a dwindling community of owners who lack the resources or reinforcements to sustain long-term preservation. For pilots who cherish aviation history, the Ercoupe's fade into obscurity represents a loss beyond economics. These aircraft connected modern pilots to the pioneering spirit of early aviation. They offered flying experiences unavailable in contemporary aircraft. But sentiment doesn't maintain airframes or fabricate parts. Without commercial viability or institutional preservation efforts, the Ercoupe is following countless other vintage designs into museums and memories. The few aircraft that remain airworthy will likely continue flying for years, maintained by dedicated owners who view preservation as a personal mission. But each annual inspection, each parts shortage, each insurance renewal makes continued operation more difficult. Eventually, the cost and complexity will exceed what individual owners can sustain. And when the last Ercoupe is grounded permanently, a unique chapter of American aviation will close forever. If you've read this far, you understand that what's happening to American general aviation isn't a temporary setback. It's a fundamental restructuring that will reshape which brands survive and which fade into history. The market that sustained these companies for decades has changed permanently, and not all of them have the resources or flexibility to adapt. Drop a comment with which manufacturer you think will survive. Hit like if you want more deep dives like this. And subscribe because we're tracking every move these companies make. The next chapter in this story is already being written, and you won't want to miss it.